Welcome to Talk Cosmos, the show where Sue Rose Minahan and guests unveil astrology's ancient archetypes that continually build the collective experiences in our unconsciousness. Get ready to find your free will from your roots in the stars. Hello, this is Sue Rose Minahan, and today is September 26th, 2020, and we repeat this Thursday morning on October 1st at 6 a.m., and that'll only be for 2 weeks because we are going to just devote this time to the Saturday night program because you can listen anytime on Podcast One, and this is being through KKNW, and that's how you listen live, like tonight. The autumnal equinox was September 22nd, and on the east coast of the United States, Eastern time, I might say, it was at 6:30 a.m. 9:30. Thank you. That was a voice from the hemispheres. Yes, 9:30. And as I was going to say, my brain is toggling because I'm on the West Coast. My guess is on the East Coast. So for the East, okay, no tongue twister here. On the East Coast, it was at 9:30 a.m. West Coast, 6:30 a.m. And Hawaii, where Sue is going to be moving, it'll be 3:30 a.m. Good, got that out. And so that's generally the focus because at the equinox, equa and nox means equal night, and the light because of how the Earth is tilted on its axis of 23.5, actually it's 23.44, but we rounded off degrees pointed north. The Earth is going northward on this solar system as we move into space. But as we tilt on our axis going westward to east, the sun, our position with the sun shifts from now it's overhead as of September 22nd and also in March for the spring equinox, directly over our equator at the center of our globe. And then as we orbit around the sun, as we have on the ecliptic, it's called the sun's path, where the planets generally range close to proximity within that same path. This is a little bit of astronomy, I know, but equinox, it's not just a word, it's a physical, visceral experience. It directs our seasons. And increasingly, in many ways, it's becoming very substantial towards understanding astrology. And on an esoteric way, it's all about light. So back to the whole little dramatic episode here that I hope you're visualizing. So Earth on its 23.5, tilted to the north, going west to east, spinning as on its orbit around the sun, comes to a point where the sun is directly overhead, shining, as it does on Earth, at the equator. And then on the northern hemisphere, because of that tilt, it slowly edges up 23.5 degrees till it reaches the Capricorn, Tropic of Capricorn. So we have winter. No more said. I think that's enough of that little brainstorm there. But it really is an intriguing factor to realize that this world is motion. And as stationary as we are with gravity, we trust this Earth continues with its gravity, of course. We are in motion everywhere, and it's not just the stars that seem to be shifting, it's our Earth as we orbit. So, equinox. With no more ado, I will say now it's time for Planet Buzz.
Focusing on planetary ecliptic orbital cycles and planetary pairs called synodic cycles connecting the planets at the same degree that begin our relationship, these are the members of Planet Buzz.
I'm Sue Rose Minahan, host of Talk Cosmos, an evolutionary astrologer and consultant, plus a certified color energy coach. I explore creative expression as an artist, a
musician, and write abundantly, stories to poetry. I love investigating mythology's language, philosophizing eternity, and I'm a perpetual student of life, seeing oneness of body, spirit of people, animals, and nature.
And I'm Dr. Laura Tad. I have a Ph.D. in human science and work as a spiritually oriented psychological astrologer with people around the world. I teach and lecture on astrology both in person and remotely. I have a blog. I have written for the Mountain Astrologer, Celestial Vibes, and Tarot.com. Additionally, I am the educational coordinator for Live Life Resources, an educational nonprofit specializing in resiliency training, education, and research.
And as the ancient Hermetic code reveals,
as below, as above, as above, as below.
Wonderful. Actually, I keep thinking I need to change that so below or so above. But that's just technicalities in the little bit of verbose. Hello, Dr. Tad. This is once again a great pleasure. I missed you last month, but I know you and Tara all did a superb job, and I'm so grateful. So I'm really excited to enter Libra with you above the horizon.
Yes, well, it's great to be back. Great to have you back and not somewhere on I-5.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going north to south like the sun, racing ahead. Okay. Actually, I couldn't see it. Unfortunately, it is a somber thought because there was smoke. Thankfully, here in Seattle, we have so much rain, it's gone. And that. So we are in a new distinction with the sun in Libra, which is really the self partnering with another. It's a fascinating moment.
Yeah. Well, we've entered a new season, right? So one of the things that with all the cardinal signs, right? So Aries, Libra, Cancer, Capricorn, whenever we shift signs, when the sun ingresses, there's a shift, but those four in particular tend to be greater demarcations of time because it's a seasonal shift. Regardless of which hemisphere you're in, it may be a different season, but it's still this seasonal shift. It's still this sort of turning of the wheels of time in a different way. And Libra is that other, right? It's the scales. It's in astrology. It's about partnership often, but other people and our relationship with other people is a lot of the archetype that we've given Libra as a sign. So that is part of the heightened attention, right? I often think of signs, I talk to clients about it, sort of like this, I use theater gels as an analogy, right? It's like, so a sign, the sun is always going to be the sun as an archetype, but then it gets this theater gel altering it of Libra that covers it, or sort of like colored glass that augments how it's expressed out in the world.
Yes, that's very true. In a sense, that reminds me of Gemini Brett, who's often talking about the moon, because it's all light. And so there are these lenses that are put on, as you say, the sun in its magnitude of the Leo essence, which the sun represents, but it is expressing that through a Libra interest of development. And when I mention Brett, Gemini Brett, he'll talk about the moon reflecting the sun's light. So it might be like right now as we speak, it's an Aquarius moon, but it's reflecting Libra light. Now, back on September 22nd, only a few days ago, when we entered this season of Libra and autumn on the northern hemisphere, the moon was in Sagittarius. So it was this Libran light being the moon in Sagittarius was reflecting Libran light. So anyway, that's maybe a little bit off from our, but he could think it was like a seed point, because Well, going back to the Libra and the four cardinal points, cardinal is action. And so it is a moment of action. And I think you brought up the idea in earlier conversation of harvest and gathering, which I really like. So I'll just leave on a note because I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Sure.
Is that the moon in Sag has a belief system, and that's our seed point. So really, perhaps we were gathering belief systems. I'll let you rock on with that.
Yeah. So I think, so the idea of harvest, right, where I was bringing it before, is that it used to be what the season was called before we called it fall, before we called it autumn in the Western world. It was called harvest. And so it's the season of harvest. That was one of its earlier names. And just sort of thinking about what that means, what that word has come to mean to us more contemporarily, if it's not a period of time, that it's now a verb, right? It's the act of harvesting. You harvest vegetables, you harvest goods. And so thinking about it in that context of, well, and that it's in Libra, which is so relational. And that harvest was also a time of gathering, right? You're both gathering things, but gathering of people. And how right now we're so challenged by that because of what's going on in the world with COVID, that physical gatherings have become really compromised. And so how is that going to be expressed this time, this year? Right, when maybe it isn't safe to harvest, to gather in the same way, and that it may be much more of an internal process. And with the moon in Libra, or with the moon in Sagittarius, as it was at the turn of the season, maybe there's a part of it of like the harvesting is actually more philosophical,
yes,
rather than physical. With Sag being the governing philosophy, right, and higher ideas, higher education. So it's sort of the harvesting of knowledge rather than physical things. And perhaps that'll be part of the theme that we find ourselves in for the next 3 months.
Well, that coordinates with this particular chart on another, as we call another signature, another echo, however it is, because often we look for duplicity or even 3 times when we're seeing the same concept, because the chart, the moment in time seems to express a direction or a purpose or a cause in various ways. So I'm noticing that Mercury, there is our thought process, our communication, for one, in Libra at 24 degrees is squaring the Capricorn, actually squaring pretty exactly Saturn, of our conditioned thoughts and ideas. So really, that's a beautiful way of thinking, of echoing that idea that you were mentioning about gathering the internal processing of our belief structures, that Sagittarius, we voice and we need, but we need to review sometimes. Right now with Mars, we're certainly reviewing it. And in fact, it's in that T-square with opposing Mars. So,
yeah, I think that there's a piece of that maybe, Mercury in Libra sort of screams mediator, right? It's as we harvest our ideas and our philosophies and our ideals, okay, well, having equanimous conversations. How do we reach across the aisle? How do we listen to other people and not be... And this challenge of that right now, with it being in opposition to Mars, where we just want to rage and we are reactionary and have super short fuses. And so that balance of, on one side, we're being called to communicate with people that we might disagree with. And at the other end of that, we're really vulnerable to being reactionary to what they say.
It is complex. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. And I'm thinking with Venus, and of course, for our audience, it's the planets are interdependent. I mean, they relate to each other on some terms. A little easier here, a little easier not, and then depending on your own chart, that is astrology. It's a whole introspection of how these light prisms or vibrations, or however you want to look at it, these energetic bodies are working. So Venus, which rules Libra, both the Sun and Mercury, really does like to find harmony. It's true. But I'm thinking it's also wanting to defend causes with Aries or with Mars, and how do we separate to, because so much of the Capricorn energy of the structure with Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter and Pallas are all regarding, I just had it on the tip of my tongue until I said all that, but it's regarding, well, it's conditioning and structure, but it's a framework. It's a framework. It's a framework of our belief structures. It's a framework. It's wanting to purge. So we want action. It's just action sometimes, as you said, can't be fast enough, especially when it's retrograde and when it's working with these huge entities. It's not just a small potato farm. And potatoes might take a lot of work too. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and I think that part of that is, so the structure that is so Capricornian and Saturnian, it's also what structures are supportive and necessary and what structures are antiquated, right? And that's part of what we're dealing with all that, the stellium and Pluto being in Capricorn. But I do think it's important to pull in the Venus piece because they're what we call mutually receptive right now.
Oh,
right?
Yes, beautiful.
Venus
with the sun. Yeah.
with the sun is governed, has its relationship is governed by Leo. Venus governs Libra. So they have, when they're in each other's signs. And so even though it's a very minor aspect, right? A semi-sextile is not a major aspect in astrology, but the fact that they're in mutual reception amplifies that exchange. So even though they're not in aspect degree wise, they are in mutual reception. And
Absolutely.
that becomes part of this story of the need for play, the need for joy, that in the midst of how serious the world is, remembering to find some levity in it.
Heart and laughter.
And that it can feel like that's one of the ways out of the overwhelm.
Oh, this is good.
That is getting this interplay of connecting with ourselves in new ways, finding how to access joy within ourselves, I think is part of that mutual reception, rather than what Libra is usually super dependent upon is other people, right? And they don't know how they feel unless they're in relationship with someone else, or how to respond until they see how someone else responds. But with that mutual reception, that's part of that foraging, part of that harvesting is accessing internal joy that isn't dependent on other people.
Oh, how beautiful. That's very beautiful. And I also noticed there's a mystic triangle with the nodes and Mercury in Libra and Mars that we had just spoken about. And earlier, when you were talking about the relationships, which of course it is, we're talking intensely with, well, I don't know, but yes, it is intense. We have Pluto involved. Always it's intense, but It takes two to tango. So I'm thinking when you said have fun, we should turn on the music. Where's Neptune? Get Neptune involved here, and or even Uranus. And there's so many ways. Yes, just.
But yeah, that
change
playful,
the tune.
creative Leonian energy, like accessing that, just playing because it's fun, just doing something because it's joyful, and it doesn't have to be rational, and you don't have to know why.
Yeah.
It brings you joy. It elevates you energetically. And makes it easier to walk through the world when it's super intense.
Absolutely. Smiles again and again. They know that there's fewer muscles than frowning. And boy, that just, I'm sorry about that. Oh, yes, direct planets. That's the other factor. Things are going to lighten up because Saturn is going direct very soon. It's going direct. We wrote it down all over the place. I think it's the 28th, 29th of this month. Yes, next week, just in a few days.
Yeah, Saturn goes direct on the 29th and then Pluto on the 4th
of October. And that's big. They've been retrograde for 4 months. So all that work and structure that we've been thinking about will have a forward motion. And it's so immediate and imperceptible at the same time. I know that Jupiter, we were just discussing and remembering, went on direct on September 13th. And I know immediately I began to feel the effects. And it was only in retrospect, I was thinking, my goodness, things are working. And then, of course, I remembered a conversation I had, and that, yes, it was actually in an energetic, reshifted relationship, because it's in appearance from Earth. It's not actually going retrograde, but it appears so that.
Yeah, well, that's optical illusion because of its proximity to the Earth. Is that retrograde period. But even just, we've had almost the whole sky retrograde for a long time. And so as stuff is now starting to move forward, of course, Mercury's going to go retrograde here in a few weeks, but, or in like 3 weeks. But a lot of the sky that's been retrograde for half the year is going to start moving forward. And so that allows for things to finish up, right? I often sort of get the image of once a planet turns direct, I sort of think about it as like a broom that's sweeping up the last little shards of things, right? It's like you've been sweeping and then you go back over it and then you've almost got everything and you go over it one last time. That's sort of that direct motion of like finishing up what has been in play for the last several months.
Many months and intensely. And you had also mentioned Forrest, Stephen Forrest, a revered astrologer. He speaks of the glyph, which is a Libra glyph, which is a line, a horizontal line, and then the second line on top of it begins to go horizontal, and then it has a half circle, and then it has, not quite a half circle, a little more than a half circle, and then it continues on, and there's a little space. And it's been related in different ways. I know that Gemini Brett calls it the setting sun there, as because it's on the west side. But you were mentioning that Stephen Forrest mentions it as a bridge. So here we are gathering. It sort of ties in together all the thoughts tonight that brought up, that bringing this harvest of inner soul thought, belief structures, which we have been doing on various forms with these large planets, the outer planets, social planets, and that being retrograde for extended periods that are slowly now beginning to go direct, is a moment of gathering up on another level of inner work, because Mars is still retrograde. And so some of these, how are we putting it into implementing it is
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think part of that idea of the bridge, I mean, it's a couple things, but some of it is even as simple as thinking about the, the natural astrology wheel, Aries, first house. Libra is the first sign that is not personal houses, right? It's this bridge, it's this shift where the first 6 houses are who you are, your money, your communication, your home, your health, your children, right? And then Libra is this turning point where it becomes your relationship with the external world.
yes.
And so that's part of that idea of it being this bridge sign, is it's what allows that transition from the inner to the outer to the collective, and makes that transition archetypally.
Thank you, Dr. Tad. What a wonderful visual as we reach across the bridge. We're going to take a small break. This is September 26th. This is Planet Buzz, a monthly edition on Talk Cosmos. And we're talking about the autumnal equinox. So enjoy your view, and Dr. Tad and I will be back.
While we take a break from this week's edition of Talk Cosmos, let's take a look at this cycle's archetype. We are currently in the Yang period of Libra, ruled dually by Venus. By leaving the lower hemisphere of the self, the energy of Libra enters the arena where the completed self meets the other than self to form a relationship based on partnership. As a cardinal air sign on the descendant angle, represented by the equinox of equal light, Libra's energy learns through comparison and relationships, with the intention to integrate duality and polarities.
Hi, this is John Luke. I'm an evolutionary astrologer, and you're listening to Talk Cosmos on Alternative Talk 1150 AM, where we discuss the meaningfulness of our roots in the stars and planets.
Multicultural, multidimensional even. Alternative Talk 1150.
Hi again, Planet Buzz for Libra, autumnal equinox, September 26th with Dr. Laura Tad and myself, Rose Minahan. And wasn't that fun to hear John Luke Chinworth, your great friend here in Seattle, talking as they have the rotational astrologers make a little commentary. So that was a nice hello, I thought.
Yeah, I love John.
Yes, right. Yeah. Well, back to this and polarity. That was a point that I mentioned in our little recording that I have that I've thought of,
Yes.
and that I think you wanted to bring attention to also, if I remember.
Yeah, well, I always think that it's very helpful when trying to understand any sign that you look at its polarity. But particularly, I think, with the cardinal signs, because they're so tied to the seasons and they are these cardinal points, right? But so part of understanding this Libran shift and is looking towards Aries, which is its polarity, it's its opposite, right? So when in the Northern Hemisphere, the spring equinox is the beginning of the zodiacal year, right? It's the first day of Aries. And so that other and relational quality of Libra is in contrast to the I am that is the key words for Aries. And so understanding that interplay of I versus them or I versus you, and that really what that's about. I mean, we look at Libra as partnership and other people, but it's also what we project onto others. It's a lot of shadow stuff, right? Which is what we, in Jungian language, of what we are uncomfortable looking at within about ourselves within, and that can be positive or negative. And Jung talked a lot about how what you don't like in somebody is really what you don't like about yourself, and what part of you is that, and that's what you're in reaction to, is that they're reminding you about parts of yourself you don't like to look at. And so part of that Libran piece, again, I think it's really an interesting time to explore Libra as an archetype, because so many of us are so isolated when Libra is such a relational sign. It's the first relational sign. And yet so many people are, there's people that haven't been interacting with almost anyone. And some people are only interacting with immediate family, at least in a physical way. And so how we navigate that now when Libra's calling us to be social.
It is absolutely I'm trying to think of the right word, and some words are, well, a dilemma. It's a real dilemma. I when you speak of the various experiences, I immediately relate in my mind to people I know very closely who are by themselves, isolated, or else just family. Or in my particular, I'm thinking of all the ors. Here, in my particular living environment that I will be leaving in October, is a small community, 10 units. About half of them are here all the time. And so, but there's a few people. It's like a recreated family. And it is interesting that we feel pretty casual with each other. Sometimes later I wonder, oh my goodness, because who knows, they might be with their family, true family, and all these contrived, necessary, or arbitrary, however we want to say it, but rules of conduct that we're wanting to follow in order to protect ourselves and others. It's quite challenging. So going back to this idea of gathering, transition, bridge, scale, choices, shadow, golden shadow, ourself, others, it's a basket. It's like a basket of posies to pick, and you hope they smell good because there's not a lot of people to look at them. It's just me and my basket.
Yeah, so I think it's a really, it's how do we navigate that? And I think that's part of this foraging too. Because as the sign progresses, as the sun progresses through the sign, it's gonna then be an aspect to all this Capricorn that we've been talking about, and all of the Aries, right? It didn't hit that. It didn't engage with those energies, the planets that are in those signs when the season turned. And it sort of all stacks up. I was looking, so by October 6th, we sort of get, the sun starts to get an aspect. It'll be 14 degrees Libra, so then it will be square Pallas, and then we sort of engage with that, all of that Capricorn, that Pallas, Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn, right, will be the first time that the sun gets in tight aspect with that stellium. And so it's building. We're in this sort of building phase of the sun moving through Libra, and that challenge of isolation in some ways intensifying over the next couple weeks.
Along with Mars.
And then it engages with Mars too. And it will do that a little bit later. I think, because of the stellium, as soon as it gets to 14, we'll really start feeling it'll still be 10 degrees different than Mars, or 9 degrees. So we'll feel it, but it won't be as intense as the sort of domino effect that you get with a stellium, right? Of like, I wouldn't say 14 to 25 is necessarily an aspect. I would, maybe because it's the sun, but any other planet, I wouldn't give a 10-degree orb, 11-degree orb.
But it begins to feel it in different ways. It's true. It grows. And it's interesting that
And that it's just as everything goes direct, which is, I think, really important, that the sun doesn't get in direct square to this stack of planets that have been retrograde in Capricorn for months until all of them are moving forward.
Oh, I love it.
And that actually feels really positive to me, because I think that it allows this stuckness. It's like it starts to break up. That's part of the energy of squares, is they're unavoidable. And they get the bad rap of being bad. Squares are bad, trines are good. No, squares can be hard. Squares are hard because you can't avoid them. Trines, you don't have to deal with.
Yeah, you have to come up with a resolution somehow. Now, it may not be the best fit later on, but life always gives us other chances. But something moves, and the earth, and in order, energy needs to move in order to recalibrate itself. And really, it is a sense. Well, I always think of how to express it, but I'm of a strong understanding that how we work with the life is with our senses of what we know, and along with the universe at large. And so it's this good. That's a great partnership, and the fact that it's meeting Pallas, the goddess of wisdom, and she's also a martial. She's a warrior of her own thought, but more strategic thinking. How excellent! And in a formatted, structured Capricorn. That's, of course, Capricorn also has its spiritual direction, but we often think of it as so material. But still, it is structures. And how are we putting those? And then with the philosophy of Jupiter, and then the purging and breaking down to regain our sense of power and new life into our structures with Pluto. And then finally, the leader of all, Mr. Capricorn, Mr.
Saturn Capricorn. Yes, yeah.
Thank you. The wise elder of the timekeeper. That and as you had brought too, there's bigger cycles ahead that all of this is shifting gears with, as I would put it, to prepare ourselves for that later in November, Jupiter conjunct Pluto. At the very end of the cycle. Well, not close. Is it 20? Is that when it's at 22 degrees again?
Yeah, the last conjunction's at 22.
The same as
as the Saturn Pluto conjunction that we had in January.
Yes. So this is quite a bookended, energetic moment of our, because when Jupiter gets together with Pluto, it can be really big decisions.
Yeah.
Is that the 13th?
Big change?
Yeah, the 13th of November, I think, the day after.
I think it's the 16th. The 13th is when Mars goes direct.
Oh, okay.
Just looking in the...
It's like knowing the right lines to a play. I think to myself, it's like, when did this go direct? When did that go retrograde? There's so many action between all the planets this year, with not just one square, but three squares, or not just one conjunction, but three conjunctions, and Pluto with every of the, well, except for Uranus, it's got Jupiter, Saturn, and, well, it doesn't have Neptune. But Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto.
I think the 14th is what it's looking like in the ephemeris. So it's right there. I mean, basically it's stacked on top of Mars going direct.
So this work we're doing of choices, of balancing, rebalancing. Balancing is always like those rocks, it's always in different formats, and it may not be so apparent, but it works. It helps bring in light from some other area. Because I often think balance has to be 50-50. No, it doesn't. It just needs to be able to operate so that it.
Right. It's the difference. And actually, I sort of went down a rabbit hole with this earlier. I'll bring it up. But Libra being the scales, being Lady Justice. And justice isn't necessarily, what's just is different than equal. Justice is different than equality. Because if what there was memes going around years ago of sort of showing the difference of like, well, equal is all these kids trying to look over the fence, watching the baseball game, standing at on the same size box, but one's a 5-year-old and one's a 16-year-old. So the fact that they have the same level of thing to stand on isn't fair. It isn't justice. It's equal. It's not just.
Wow.
What's just is if the 3-year-old gets a box that's 2 feet taller than the 16-year-old, because now they're all at the same level and can all see the game.
Oh, that's just lovely.
And so the rabbit hole I went down thinking about Libra as justice is Lady Justice, right? That is carrying the scales.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, oh, well, we've got to, there must be an asteroid for the goddess that she's named after. And there is. In Greece, it's Themis, Themis, and there's an asteroid. It's asteroid 26 in, if you wanted to put it into your software. And so currently she is at 21 degrees Scorpio. And she moves into Sag basically when the sun ingresses into Scorpio. On the 21st, 22nd, depending on what your time zone is, she ingresses into Sagittarius.
And that's
or into Scorpio. It moves, yes. So she moves into Sag.
Yeah.
Themis.
Okay, got it. That's what I thought. Okay.
And then she's at 4, and just out of curiosity, I was looking, and she's at 4 degrees Sag on the election. On election day, here in the States. But so, yeah, she's currently 21 and just sort of thinking about, okay, if Libra's justice and seeing where that falls in, in the chart, the what's going on now and looking at that. And so it looks like, she's in a sign for, I don't know, about a month or so, 2 months based on the speed I was seeing. So in that, throughout November, she'll be in Sagittarius and crossing over the current South Node. And how that may engage, what does that do? That just, if, assuming that her name is accurate to her archetype as an asteroid, just sort of thinking, okay, this 4 degree Sag point gets pretty close to the U.S. ascendant.
12, yes, 12 degrees.
Yeah, I mean, it's moving that direction, and I, based on the astrology, I will be shocked if we have the results on election day. So it's very possible that all of this lining up of Mars is going to be retrograde, doesn't go direct till the 13th, all this Jupiter-Pluto square on the 14th, and then Themis conjunct the U.S. sun, all sort of around the same time. Seemed like an interesting confluence of events.
Not U.S. sun, but the current.
The U.S. ascendant. The U.S. ascendant.
Yeah, the ascendant. Okay, yeah. It is significant. That is the astrology of watching. I'm really grateful you brought this up, and it's a matter of finding out how the wills of different forces on all sides operate. you know, that's a fascinating.
Yeah, well, and so this idea of her being Lady Justice, which is she carries a scale, which is the symbol of Libra. And so that's how I got there with my research. The rabbit hole I fell down was thinking about the scales and iconography we have around that, and that it's Lady Justice.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's even female feels important, right? There's so many images throughout our culture that are elevating male archetype, and yet she's the one who's elevated when it comes to justice and equanimity, that it's not a man, it's a woman. Feels like it's part of the story of this Libran time, and maybe that all is reflected too in who will be galvanized in the wake of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing.
Yes.
And again, this idea of a female justice who was about fairness and justice for everybody, but really leading this charge for women.
And
in the idea. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you were going to say the idea of something. I was just thinking of femininity, the lunar aspect of any of us, that is the receptivity, and that really the energetic descriptions are experiences, not just descriptive. The descriptions are changing because of the experiences and the consciousness collectively through all of this many aspects, just to name it generally, that we've talked about and are talking about, between the receptivity. And it has a lot to do, I think, with what Mars wants. Mars, which is our direction. Mars, which is in Aries for these 6 months. It's retrograde right now, is asking how to forge, as foraging and forge these new identity, the new systems of action, the new systems of how we go forward, and it relates to how we receive, what is justice, how for all or for anyone. And boy, it's all just many sides of the prism. So what you were going to say, it's the idea of something. I hope I didn't.
Well, I think that's part of it. And just so this idea of, along those lines, I think you said sort of what I was going to say.
Because I'm looking at the other asteroids, speaking of the feminine as far as balance, and it's potent. Juno in Scorpio, 0 degrees Scorpio, just left Libra after months and months and months, since January, of being in Libra all year. And retrograde when nobody, all these, really none of the other planets were retrograde, and now has just entered Scorpio, of really intense exchange for mutual, of resources and for life and for true commitment. And that's what, and right on the ascendant, at 0 degrees, and our ascendant at that seed point for the equinox was 1 degree. So it's right there. And then Eris at 24, Mars soon to, and Eris is so slow in that 500-year orbit that Mars will be conjunct. And of course, she wants truth above all. And then there's Vesta in Leo, conjunct that Venus that you brought up so beautifully, that's in mutual reception with the sun. So of our hearth, of what our home, of the daily activities. So really our commitments of Juno that wants the truth also, and truth comes in many ways, perspective, that's what I'm saying, because there's Sagittarius and Scorpio and all that. And then Eris, it's really...
I think there's something I kind of like Juno and Scorpio. Because it's so no nonsense. It's like Juno's just she's not gonna tolerate it. She's not gonna tolerate ridiculousness. And I think it would potentially be a challenging aspect natally, but for what's going on in the world right now, I think it can be galvanizing.
That's a good word, galvanizing. Pluto.
It can be like righteous anger, which is part of Juno as an archetype in some ways. It just feels like in Scorpio, it amplifies that of like, yep, no, I'm done. I'm not tolerating over it. Not happening.
We were just talking earlier about Persephone, or I think we were, because we do have a little chat before. And Juno is trying, exactly trying at 0 degrees Scorpio, 40 minutes, to Ceres at 0 degrees Pisces, 40 minutes. I mean, it's exact to the degree and second. So Ceres, the mother who lost her Persephone, and in the larger context of as the world, as growth, which at the time we're at, we have the harvest and we're getting prepared for this loss of the season here in the Northern Hemisphere, of where the sun is going towards that Tropic of Capricorn, where it will be winter at the solstice in December 21st, which is when also Jupiter and Saturn will have left Capricorn and united in Aquarius for this new 800-year cycle. And in air, it's going to be monumental, and there's so much to incorporate, to integrate, and it's I like your reminder to be joyful, so that we don't get hung up with sorrow as we're left maybe with ourselves.
Well, and so I think, absolutely. And part of that Persephone, so the link with Persephone, and harvest and Ceres is the goddess of harvest, right? So the fact that we are in harvest, it's harvest season, she is deeply intertwined with this time of year because she is the goddess of the harvest.
Yeah, to be grateful for all that we have. Oh, go ahead.
And it was when Persephone made her descent into the underworld.
And the loss.
And the loss and the grief that Ceres has, or Demeter has, right? Proserpina, if we're going to use Ceres, we should use the Roman Proserpina instead of Persephone. And that again, it's sort of this inner seeking. Persephone going into the underworld doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's this inner process, going inward, looking internally.
Yes. It reminds me, as we go into the night, thinking of Equinox, where now the equal night begins, less light here as we approach winter in the 3 months from here, and the moon shimmering across the water, and how beautiful it is, the light being reflected. It, in some ways, can be like the imagery of us taking that bridge down below, instead of above, into the depths of our inner selves. A quick mention, next week will be the Moonbeam team, and we'll be talking about the Aries full moon and then the Libra new moon, and that's with Liz Mouchette and Sarah Stromley. So do join us on next Saturday. And tonight is with Dr. Laura Tad, and this is the Planet Buzz, and we're talking about autumnal equinox and all its ramifications, which is such an energetic spin-off. And here we are talking about inverting our bridge, taking a selfie down below in the realms of waters. Yeah.
Well, and this inner process, this inner knowing, right? And the underworld gets a bad rap. It's not, I think because in our culture, sometimes people equate the underworld with hell, and that's not what the underworld
not at all
is. It's not what it was in mythology. It's the land of the dead, but that's different than hell.
Exactly, because if we do think of living, it's eternal. And that
It's the
internal
land of transition.
Yeah,
It's
and
the-
that internal self is where the life is. And to connect with that truism rather than seeing the mirror outside, which Libra and its shadow, is to integrate that light and
Yeah.
sing a
Yeah.
song.
Yes.
Sing a song. Well, this is the time to say adieu until again, wonderful Dr. Tad. And
Yes, it was great to be here again. Thank you, Sue.
well, I'm always enjoying it. And we love you, audience, and welcome your listening. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you for listening to Talk Cosmos, the show where Sue Rose Minahan and guests unveil astrology's ancient archetypes that continually build the collective experiences in our unconsciousness. Be sure to tune in next Saturday at 6 p.m. to continue finding your roots in the stars.